Welcome to Business Beyond the Mic, where we join Carly Van Heerden, CEO and founder of We Edit Podcasts. Together, let's uncover the art of podcasting.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Business Beyond the Mic. I'm your host, Carly Van Heerden. Today on the show, we welcome Pearce Campbell. So Heather is the host of the Guts, Grit, and Great Business podcast. She is a warrior mama, nature lover, and dedicated attorney and legal coach for world-changing entrepreneurs. Based in Seattle, she is the mom of two little wild munchkins and founder of Pearce Law PLLC, home to her legal practice. She is also the creator of the legal website Warrior, an online business that provides brand protection, legal education, and support to information entrepreneurs such as coaches, experts, consultants, online educators, speakers, and authors all around the US and the world. She hoards information, paper, and books while secretly dreaming of becoming a minimalist and relishes an occasional rare night with her hubby when the kiddos are miraculously asleep and she can soak up HGTV without guilt. Now, Heather is such an incredible super connector, and during our conversation, she shows us how she was able to leverage her network to support her clients and her audience during the turbulent time of COVID. She also demonstrates how she uses the technique of multiplexing to create even deeper connections with others. Now, Heather is such a big proponent of having the right systems in place for your podcast production. She has clear goals for her conversations and is always trying to find ways to further build her network. Of course, she also shares her incredible advice and tips for protecting yourself as a podcaster on the legal front. I had such a blast in this conversation and digging into her podcasting story, so let's get into it. Heather, welcome to Business Beyond the Mic. It is so great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Carly. So great to connect with you and be here. Very happy to be chatting with you today.
Yes, amazing. And I know you have such a unique perspective to offer our listeners today, so I can't wait to jump into your story and everything. So why don't you start us off to tell us a bit more about yourself, your business, your brand, and of course, your podcast?
Yes. Well, twist my arm. I guess I'll talk about myself. So the quick overview is that I'm an attorney based here in Seattle, Washington, and I've been practicing law for over 20 years now. I've got primarily two ways that I serve my clients, and one is through my quote unquote traditional legal practice, although I will say there's not that much that is traditional about me. So I've got my legal practice, but then I also started a secondary business, which is essentially an alternative legal service provider model that was an alternate route for serving the same clients. And it was just my solution, and that's the legal website Warrior. It was my solution to many of the challenges in the marketplace that my clients, who are all small business owners, face when they go to the traditional legal market. And so there were frustrations that I had, and I thought, well, maybe I can build a different model. So I launched the legal website Warrior years ago, kind of midway through my career. And so that's what I've been doing ever since, is serving online. They're basically online information-based businesses, a lot of expert-based businesses as well, that largely operate in the online space and have a lot of legal needs associated with their business. And so it's my joy to serve those people, my clients I love. They are all very mission-driven, very conscious entrepreneurs, and I love helping them build their businesses. So, that's the quick of the work that I do. And then I do also have a podcast. We were just talking before we went live that I launched Guts, Grit, and Great Business right as the pandemic hit. And it was really, my goal with my podcast was to create business conversations that supported business longevity, business building and business longevity, because I thought, here's this thing coming for all these small businesses and nobody's really talking about it. And we need to have conversations around perseverance, grit, what it actually takes to build a small, thriving business, and what it takes to be in the game for the long run.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, because the thing is that carries through in everything else that you do too, including your podcast, which requires some guts and some grit and all the perseverance to make it past, episode number 10 or whatever.
Right. What do they call pod fade?
Yes.
Somewhere in there, episode 8 or 10.
Yes. Oh, well, it's so great to hear your story and your background. And I know that you love sharing stories on your podcast as well, because that is the heart of what you love to do. Now, when you were thinking of launching the podcast, did you have any fears or something like an obstacle that you faced before you put it out into the world?
Well, so how the podcast came about was I was actually at an event and talking about like what was happening days before the pandemic hit. You were having a baby. I joke with people like my baby during COVID was a podcast. Some people had puppies, some people had real babies. Mine was the podcast. But I went from never thinking about a podcast or even knowing anything about how to launch one to being in conversation with a couple of guys that I met at a conference who became friends. And they were like, you really need a podcast. And of course, later I learned like, oh, they were the podcast hammer. Everybody else is the podcast nail. But I took their message to heart. I was like, I do. And then I thought about it and I was like, I do. Yeah. But of course, the first hurdle is I knew nothing about launching a podcast, right? And it felt in my mind like a really big, hard hurdle to clear, right? Because I didn't have any knowledge about what it takes. But what it meant is, of course, these guys who are the podcast hammer had a course that I went through, and it was really inexpensive, like $497 or something. I went from never having thought about a podcast to having one fully created, episodes recorded, branding, like everything done and launched in 4 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was fabulous. And the only reason, because my whole goal in launching the podcast was one, to bring important conversations to small business owners around perseverance, grit, longevity, like what it takes to build a business and a really thriving life. And I wanted to do it in a way that did not stress myself out.
Yes.
Right? Because I was like, here I'm suddenly home with 2 kids, running 2 businesses, having to be mom, and in some ways, school teacher, like so many parents, like online school for my son was just not a thing. It did not work for him. So there was a lot going on. And I thought I need to be able to do this podcast in a way where I can joyfully show up and have the conversations, but I know that I've got a system in place to do all the rest. And so luckily I had that system built before I launched, and we're now well past 3 years. And I think we talked about, I've got well over 200 episodes recorded. I think 172 have published. So it's been fun. It's been a really good journey for me.
Well, but it's amazing to see that, you don't have to do this all on your own and figure out everything step by step. You can go out there, you can get a course or a launch package or somebody to guide you along the journey. Because I know even for myself, when I started thinking along the roads of being behind the mic, I was like, where do I even start? So I'm like, oh, hey team, like, where do I start? But
totally. Please don't do it yourself.
Yes.
Like this is the whole point in business or creating anything. So often we think we have to trudge along, do it ourselves, figure it all out. Like, no, just go to the expert, find out what you need, get good help, get support in place for doing it. And it will go so much faster.
Have you seen any major changes in your business itself as a direct response to your podcast, or how has that influenced your companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things have happened, and I will admit I did not I did not have a good, what should we say, a good strategy around how to monetize the podcast, right? So when I launched, my goal was really create this platform, having certain conversations that I wanted to have that I knew would support my clients. Goal number 2 was also to create a platform where I could invite colleagues and peers on to, give them a way to share their message and their expertise. And because I love people and I love, it's like people hate this word, but I love networking. I love meeting new people and learning about their businesses and building, because I also have a really big, what should I call it, referral tree in my business. When I get to know my clients and then I spot that they have other needs, I'm regularly making referrals and new connections. So I'm a little bit of a super connector that way. And so I always love, like I tell people, I collect information and people, And so for me, it was a way to serve some of those people that I collect that have important messages that I can help leverage, right? So that was goal number 2. And then obviously goal number 3 was to use these conversations to support clients, potentially attract new clients, whatever. But a lot of the power that has come out of having a podcast relates to relationship building with the guests that then lead to other opportunities I couldn't have anticipated, right? Whether they become a client or they refer me a great client, right? I've also done a lot of podcast guesting on other people's podcasts because I have, I'm in a very narrow niche and not a lot of people teach on legal stuff. And so for me, even a surprise coming out of guesting on other people's podcasts is having relatively short conversations that result in like a 10-minute call. And then I've just enrolled a new $25,000 client. Like you build that credibility before they even meet you,
Yes.
And so that has happened as well, where, I've created multiple clients out of just having a single conversation. So it's, and you never know how or when that's going to happen. My overall strategy with the podcast and truthfully with podcast guesting is I see it all as relationship building and planting seeds. And in business, you just always have to be planting seeds, and you just have to choose like what strategy works for you to be able to do that.
Yeah. That's incredible advice, because that's the thing. You don't have to think about the immediate effects right now. You're thinking about what's going to happen down the line. How is my tree going to grow, whether for your business or for just relationships, as you said, which is, it's a good strategy to think that way long term, especially with a podcast, because you want to have it be a long term game. You're in it for the long haul.
Well, and I think, sorry, I don't mean to step over you. I got excited, but I think people do make a mistake on this point because they start to podcast guest or they start their own podcast. And if they don't see like immediate monetizable results, they really start to lose momentum and give up. And I think the gift for me in not having, I would say, a really clear path or strategy at the start for monetizing is that I did have a long-term perspective. And I really saw it as an opportunity for creating a new platform for developing relationships, serving a bigger audience. And then the benefits have been that it builds your authority, but it also helps you, not secretly, but kind of, it feels secretly, like build all these relationships that you don't even know about before they actually intersect with you.
Yeah, no, agreed. And it's more than just those people on your show. It's whoever they know, right? It's the next, you're one connection away from something big that could happen, that could change your whole strategy and path of your life, right? So
totally.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Totally.
So when you were thinking about your success in the beginning of the podcast, what metrics did you focus on? I know it's not about all the downloads, etc., but how did you know that, yes, I'm in the right direction. This is where I should be headed?
I will be honest, I didn't focus on metrics. I focused on the person in front of me, trying to create a meaningful conversation with every guest and just trusting, even if it's 2 people, I didn't know how many would show up to listen, right? Even if it's 2 people that show up, that they maybe were the ones that needed to hear the conversation that day. And part of it was probably I didn't have capacity at the time to even worry about the numbers. Being a mom who just got both my kids home full time again at the start of COVID and trying to run 2 businesses and launch my podcast. I was like, here's what I can do. And for me to do this joyfully, I have to focus on inviting great guests, being consistent, having a system that supports the production of this podcast, and then, we'll see where it goes.
No, I agree. I mean, I'm even sitting here thinking to myself, I don't even think I've looked at any of my downloads yet. I'm out here to learn. Like this is about me and my listeners, but also about me a bit. It's like, what am I gaining? And it's been, this journey has been amazing so far. I mean, it's so short for me already, and I've learned so much, like such rich, valuable conversations that you wouldn't have anywhere else. And
totally.
Yeah, it's just, I've been loving it. So
Yay! Hooray for another podcast.
Oh, wow. But that's the thing though. Like if you are thinking of growing your audience, building your show around what you're doing, how do you then tailor that specifically for you, who you say you have this smaller niche or a specific niche? How do you get guests to fall in line with the type of content that you have, or how do you structure that for yourself?
Yeah. So for me, I was really clear that, my goals for the conversations were about business perseverance, having grit, because part of it is like literally at the conference where I could see COVID kind of coming our way. This was end of February in 2019 and
2020 actually.
Or 2020. I know the years are almost together now. But thinking like nobody's talking about this and what it's going to do to small businesses, especially small businesses who had some element of in-person work or strategy or networking associated with their business and their business building path. And anyways, it was something that when I came home, and I'm in Seattle, so we were ground zero for COVID in the States, like March 1, I was pulling my kids out of school. March 3, the whole city went into lockdown, like shut down. The big downtown companies stopped employees from going downtown. Schools were shut down. It was immediate. And I remember sending out a newsletter to my list, I think on March 3rd, that basically said, like, here's what you need to do in light of COVID, right? So my goals early on were really about creating conversations to support perseverance of these small businesses. And over time, really what I found is that like business is a really big conversation, right? And my podcast is called Guts, Grit, and Great Business, but it's really about, because all the entrepreneurs that I'm talking to are small business owners. And if you're a small business owner, right, and especially during COVID, oh my gosh, your personal and your business life is like this, like literally you're parenting and being in your business the same minutes all day long.
24/7.
Right. But it became so obvious to me on the platform that we were going to be having much bigger conversations. Yes, I wanted people to come learn business basics, business building strategies. All of my guests have some element of that in their conversations, all from, different areas of expertise and unique perspectives, whether it's marketing, sales, technology, right? There's some element that they have a superpower in when it comes to the business building space. But so often my favorite parts of the conversation were around personal stories and some of the personal elements that found their way into the conversation that really reflect on what business building is actually about. It's about supporting a thriving life.
Yes. Oh, that's incredible. Because that's the thing. The problems you face in your business, you can make a strategy, a plan, and tackle it. It's the things that happen behind the scenes in your personal life, in who you are, that either derail you or, throw you off balance. And then you still have to strategize and face things.
Totally.
So that's where people relate and they find that common ground and they want to know, how did you do that through, whatever it was at the time? COVID obviously was a huge thing, but people were losing family members, friends, everything through that, right? So many variables in your personal life that can alter the way that you persevere. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you're right that those are the pieces that people like to hear about. There's a term, my friend Jay Facette, who I adore, he introduced me to a term called multiplexing. And the way that he uses the term multiplexing is he says, if you and another person can connect on more than one point, like, oh, you have a dog? I have a dog. Oh, you have a special needs kid? I have a special needs kid. Oh, you're also a mom or a business owner. You know what I mean? Like the more points of connection that you feel with somebody, the more likely you are to reach out, to go follow them online, to go look at their work, to say like, I want to know more about what this person is doing and how they support people. And maybe I'm one of their people, right? So for me, it was really important from the beginning to help that multiplexing effect by asking questions that brought out different elements of a person's background, personality, personal experience, so that guests felt like almost like they were sitting down to a dinner conversation, not to like an event on stage,
like a production word.
Totally.
No, I love that word, multiplexing, because when I'm thinking about it, I get this vision of a web, like you're doing this with your fingers. It's much stronger than one single thread. Yeah.
Totally.
That's incredible.
Totally.
So you mentioned earlier that you didn't have much of a monetization strategy to begin with, but I mean, now you're 3 years in, it's 200 episodes recorded. What is your focus on now when it comes to monetization?
Yeah. So it was an accidental strategy, right? And it was one that once I was probably, I want to say a year and a half in, I was like, oh, this is just what happens when you sit down and spend an hour or even a little more talking with somebody and getting to know their story and asking them a lot of questions. You build rapport, right? And so I had multiple, probably 3, $25,000 clients from just having a simple conversation, plus numerous others that maybe hired me for smaller projects or referred friends or their clients or introduced me to whole audiences, right? So truthfully, there's no way for me to accurately monetize it because you follow so many of those threads, and down the line, whether it's months down the line, right, that can result in additional clients. But yeah, the benefit has been obvious. And like I said, it was also totally an accidental strategy.
Wow. No, it's networking in a whole new level, building relationships and just getting the benefits to come your way.
And it really, what I would like for people to take away from this piece of the conversation is about how complex sometimes we make business, but how at its very root, it's really about having conversations with people where it's value first. You get to know each other. You're genuine. Business is going to happen.
No, it's so true, because anywhere, even if you have the best website or the best online process, people still want that touch point, somebody real on the other side, to check in with them, to have a conversation, to give them advice. And if there's nothing there, then it's like they're going to just walk away, because why are they going to stay?
So true.
Yeah. Wow. Well, now what's next for your podcast? I mean, it's a bright future coming along. COVID has lifted.
Right. What is next for my podcast? I know I've thought about that, and, probably I should do more marketing than I'm doing. I mean, it's pretty simple approach, but, I've thought about expanding the ways that I get visibility to my podcast. I will continue doing what I'm doing, which is reaching out to really quality people who have an important message or expertise to share, and really just investing in those conversations. So that will continue to be my primary strategy. And who knows? Anything could happen. And so I tend to just be very flexible and just watch as it evolves and just try to enjoy the process.
Yeah, totally. I heard someone say the other day too, it's just make sure that you're still finding the joy in it. And if it doesn't work, pivot, be malleable, change the way that you want to do it and find it again so you can keep doing what you do. So
yeah, totally. And for me, I've thought about, because it's so like, I look at, 172 conversations in, there are a ton of resources and gems and wisdom within those conversations. So there's part of my brain that really wants to like distill those down almost to like a library, like here's all the links and resources. So I have thought about kind of creating like a vault or a library of resources that result from the podcast. So I don't know, we'll see. I'd definitely have to hire help on that to do all the compilation and stuff, but it is an idea that intrigues me, or even like a mini booklet.
I was going to say that
with all the little gems, you know what I mean? Because, and here's the reality about the power of information is, and this is why I love podcasts, I love books, like it's why I hoard information in people. The power of like one tidbit of information to change your viewpoint or your perspective or lead to the next best thing in your life. Like, it's everywhere.
Yes.
Every conversation could change your life.
Yes. No.
So yeah, I really love that.
Oh, that's lovely. I mean, can't wait to see what you do next. This is going to be amazing. I kind of want to sneak in one question here. Because of your legal background, is there anything that listeners should know about their podcast on that front, like in the legal realm of things?
Totally. Yeah. A couple things that are super easy and also like very minimal, right? So what I have built into my process and what I do for all my clients is an interview release. And that is, so most of us, if you've automated or systematized your podcast procedures, you've got a calendar or a booking link that you send somebody. For me, when you go to mine, it collects all the information that I need about a guest before I start the show, right? So I've got their bio, I've got their company information, I've got all the information that I consider important to have before I hit that record button, right? And I collect it through that calendar form. One of the check boxes has the link to my interview release form, and they must consent to that so that I have their agreement that I can record the conversation, that I'm able to publish an edited version of that conversation, and, that I won't have any liability for doing that. But that's the intent. And well, people might be like, oh, well, that seems so obvious. There are circumstances where it can really come back to bite you if you don't have that. And so like one example, one of my clients actually, he told me this story where he'd had a conversation. And actually, this just happened on my podcast. I recorded a great conversation. I went to publish it and learned that the place of employment for my guest had changed, which makes that whole conversation pretty irrelevant. Okay, so what happens if you've already published that conversation, right? Or maybe they said something that later they regretted saying or whatever, like you just can't know what could go wrong. And that's why it's really important to have a written consent that says, I agree to the recording and the publication of this. And so what had happened in that instance is the guy had come back to my client and been like, you have to take this recording down, like he had raved about his employer. Now he hated his employer, this kind of stuff. And my client is like, well, once you hit publish, that like there's no way to pull it back from all the RSS feeds, right? There's no way to take it off of people's phones after it's already been downloaded. Like there's no way to basically undo that liability. So just one simple example, but there's many more along that same vein. And just having a simple interview release form, whether it's something that's checked the box, whether you email it and you just get a signature, like, make it as easy as possible for people. I love the check the box version, right? And just incorporate it in your process. But that's one of the easiest things you can do to protect your ability to record that interview, get it published, right? So that's step number one. Step number two is in the context of where you host your podcast. For me, for example, it's part of my main website, right? So I've got my main legal website, warrior.com site, and my podcast is a section of that site. So when people get access to the show notes, the recordings, the video recordings, etc., I still want all of that information protected. So my website protection package, which has website terms and conditions, privacy policy, like all of the legal stuff that you need to be online, be publishing information, protecting your IP, right? It envelops that podcast. So that's thing number 2 is like, where are you hosting the podcast? And do you have your legal terms up? Right? If not, let's have a chat. I love helping, information entrepreneurs protect all their best information. The third thing that typically people may require in the podcasting space, depending on the title that they choose for their podcast, is a trademark registration to protect the title. Because what happens is certain podcasts take off, or they get certain notoriety, or you even match your podcast to like some of your business branding. Like many of my clients have overlaps there. Protect the podcast name so nobody else can take it as their podcast title, as their business title, and be using that in commerce, right? So I do a lot of trademark protection around podcasts as well. But those are the 3 primary things to look at.
Well, that's great advice. I mean, it's something that people, especially the interview release, because you think everyone is going to operate in good faith with you, understanding the process, but
you just never know what's going to happen.
You never know.
That's the hard part about being human, right?
Yeah. That's the thing. I was talking to someone earlier too about choosing your guests, and you do vet them and you kind of decide who you want on, but sometimes you might miss something. And then immediately when you're talking to them, you realize, oh, this might not be a great fit. And if you don't have that kind of protection, right, it leaves you vulnerable to things that you didn't even think that you would have to deal with down the road.
Right. And the interview release, actually, when it's done well, right, my version says like you have the right to the recording, but not the obligation to use it. So if, for example, the scenario that you just mentioned came up, and it's interesting because you before you went live, you were talking about some of the questions we might cover, including any foibles in launching or producing a podcast, right? And what I would say to people is build into whether you call it your system or just the way that you address your podcast, because I always leave room for the fact that although I tend to invite really good people onto my podcast, I have had a couple of misfits, in over 200 interviews, I've maybe had 2 interviews that I decided not to publish for one reason or another, right? And I reserve the right to do that. And with one guest, I actually told her, I don't think that we can publish this conversation. And then I told her why. And while that's super challenging, a lot of people are like, oh, I'm cringing just at the idea of having to have that tough conversation. I invite you to leave room in your mind that could happen along your podcast journey and to be really direct about it so that you don't have false expectations or a really upset guest. They might be upset in the moment, like, oh gosh, turns out she was just super stingy, wouldn't answer my questions in a very helpful way other than to say, like, go buy the book. And I'm like, this is just not interesting. Right. And so it was like attempt after attempt to try to kind of like peel the layer of the onion to get to something good. And we just couldn't get there. So, have it built in beforehand so that you recognize you have something like a tool in that moment you can use, even if it's just a little blip that you say to put somebody on notice, like this is just not a workable conversation. I won't be publishing it. It'll save you a lot of heartache down the road, So just, be aware that we're all human. We make mistakes. We don't do a perfect job vetting people. You might end up with somebody who's not a great guest, and you don't have to publish the episode.
And that's okay, because kind of a theme that's been running through is you are the host and you are protective of your audience. You've created the space for them. You keep them in mind and put their best interests first. So if that means not publishing an episode, let it be that way then.
And you're in charge of the financial responsibility that it takes to run and host a podcast. And that's no small thing. And so you're investing time and money not only into the recording of the conversation by taking the time to do that, but all the editing, the marketing, everything that goes into the post-production, right? So be possessive. Feel free to make decisions that are the best decision for you and your podcast and your guests.
Yes, that's amazing. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. I think it's been a refreshing topic for us to cover and so helpful because you have to be thinking about those things too. Yeah. Well,
totally.
Now we're going to jump into the fun little quick fire 4 section. So you can just answer whatever you want. You can expand. You don't have to, whatever you feel. Yeah. Just to see where it goes. So the first question is, how has podcasting changed the way you do business and even life?
First of all, it has been a joy for me to podcast. So I love that it has added very little to no stress. Like there have been a few nights, I'll be honest, where I ended up doing like a little late night editing, mostly not. And that is because of the system. But it's expanded my reach, expanded my network, expanded the way that I get to serve the clients I'm already serving.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I love that we discussed it all and people can just delve into it. But yeah. So as a podcaster, what are your top 3 tools or non-negotiable investments that you have for your podcast?
Number 1 is my calendaring system, right? Where I make everybody go through that. And the funny thing is I will just say a few people try to opt out. Like there are a lot of folks who are agents for people looking to be placed on podcasts. If you happen to be listening to this podcast, I'm going to invite you to follow somebody's system.
Yes.
They have a system for a reason, and it is generally to make your and their life easier. Yes. So that's number 1 is I love my calendaring system. I love, getting all of the information that I need right up front and then having all the automation through the calendar, sending Zoom links, etc. Way easier. 2 is a podcast editor. Right? Really streamlines everything for me. So there was a time I edited my own episodes. It was worth doing from the standpoint that it makes you a better podcast host when you have to listen to every mistake that you're making. And as soon as you get that down and you refine your podcasting style, get yourself an editor if you don't have one already, right?
Yes. 100% agree.
And then, totally. And then number 3, which really probably should be first, is having the whole system designed, having a whole step-by-step system, like very detailed from how the invites get sent, how they get tracked, how you collect everybody's headshot if it's not collected in your form. Like, I think it's probably like a 25-point system for me. It's not like 3 things, right? To the editing, to the production schedule, everything. So just make sure you've got a system that works when you launch and then revise it as you go. See it as a working system.
No, I agreed. And I love the system because it's saving me time. Now that I've got mine streamlined, it's like I am much more efficient with it. I am still listening through my episodes. So I am learning about my host style and where I can improve. So yeah, anywhere you can build that in, just do it.
Totally.
Yeah. Now, switching gears, you mentioned before a few foibles, podcast fails. What are some that you've experienced?
Well, the one was really inviting the wrong guest that I didn't know at the time was the wrong guest, right? And having to deal with that in the midst of like a fairly awkward conversation. And she got pretty defensive and is like, well, I've done, a lot of guesting, and just one of those, it did not work for this particular conversation. Like we just couldn't get to the good stuff. So, painful experience as a host and as a guest. I didn't want her to feel bad, but I wanted her to know why I couldn't publish it. Yeah. Right. And I didn't want to send her like a fake reason later. I just needed to address it because I also couldn't keep recording.
Did you just stop in the middle of it?
Yeah. Oh, wow. I just said, I don't think this is a fit. And I thanked her for her time. And we got off. So that was definitely felt like a foible. But I also look back on that and I go, I'm not really sure there was a way to vet for that. Yeah. And maybe, and what I have done since then is at the start of the conversation, I remind people, I'm looking for really juicy, like tips and action items that leave my audience with something that they could go work on right now. Right. And also I remind them that because the only other thing that I would consider a foible is I had a few guests that really thought about a podcast recording like a stage, where they just wanted to fly through their 20-minute presentation and it wasn't a conversation. And that was like, oh boy. So I remind people ahead of time, like I tell them a couple things. One, that my goal is that I help them with the multiplexing so that people get to learn different and interesting facets about them as a person, about their work, etc., increasing the likelihood, hopefully, that people will reach out and connect and follow them and all of that good stuff. And that I want it to feel like a dinner conversation. I want it to feel like somebody sat down and participated in a great conversation with us, right? And that changes really for, I think, a lot of my guests, changes the feel and approach because they go, oh yeah, I get it. And it also makes them, I think, feel more at ease. Like, okay, I don't have to feel like I'm giving this presentation in just expert mode, you know?
Yeah. Because you have something to offer. You don't have to be, accurate on everything that you say and have all the stats at hand. I mean, you can reference it. People can look those things up. You have to give your experience and what you've perceived and what's helped you grow. Right.
Totally. Yeah. Just be a real person, right? Yeah. Have a real conversation. That's what people want.
And honestly, it's nice to know that you can stand up for yourself and what you want as a guest. And I mean, in my process so far, as short as it's been, I've had someone agree to an interview and then they were like, actually, now that I've looked over your questions, I don't think I'm going to be a good fit. At first I thought, oh, that's odd. You have a podcast. How are you not a fit? But then I just backtracked and I was like, if she doesn't feel comfortable, I'm not going to force her to come on the show. And maybe, what am I going to achieve?
Saving us both the time.
I said, thanks for being upfront. That's I totally respect your decision. The invitation is open and it remains open. So even if you want to connect in the future, just be kind and
totally
let them experience it the way they do. So yeah. Great advice on that one. Now, my final question is the fun one. If money or time were not a factor, what would be next for your podcast?
Ooh, probably some paid placements with some very specific names. Yeah.
Do you have some in mind?
I'm not going to say them out loud. No, but I do have some in mind. And I've actually thought about that, right? Getting really creative. Because the other thing I know about some of the bigger names is that even doing something really interesting, like donating to a favorite charity in their name, or coming up with a creative way that also makes them feel excited to have, quote unquote, another podcast conversation. Right. But it's also about, I think, being creative and finding ways to serve other people in a way that's really meaningful to them so that they're willing to come on and serve your audience.
Yeah, no, totally. I love that. The thing is, sometimes you can't forget about yourself too. You are a great podcast host and you have so much to offer. So sponsor some of your own things and, use.
Totally, which I do. Yeah. Yep.
I always tell people, don't forget about yourself. You're out there. Your listeners are there to hear what you have to say as well. So yeah.
Well, and also what I'd like to do more of is like a sponsorship swap, right? Giving people sponsorships on my podcast where their message is aligned with my audience and my message is aligned with theirs. Because there's a few podcasters in the space that I know where that is true.
Yes.
So yeah, that could be a fun one also.
Totally. Oh, well, Heather, I feel like we have covered so many topics and you've given so much great advice. And I just thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here, for sharing your story and being open to give our listeners a look into what it's like to be a podcast host.
Oh, totally. So happy to join you. I have loved my podcast. And when people say, oh, I've been thinking about it for years or whatever. I'm like, years? I thought about it for like a week and then launched. Like, just go do it. Don't let all these ideas that it's too hard or you don't know what you're doing or like, just don't let any of that get in the way. Just like do it, especially if it's been on your heart or mind for a while to do. It's calling your name.
Yeah, totally. And the thing is, everyone you do, you just get better and things keep rolling smoother.
Yes, that is true. And also be willing to go through the learning curve and the hump, because at first, I think it was before we were recording, you talked about how painful it was to like listen to yourself. I hated that. I really went through a phase at the beginning, especially when I was doing my own recording and editing, where I was like, I don't know if I should be doing this, right? But at some point, like, you just have to get over yourself. And it's also a really good exercise to do more of that, because we all really need to do more of that.
Just have to get out of your own way so that you can move forward.
Exactly. Totally.
Oh, well, I can't wait to share this with everyone. And thanks so much for tuning in. And we will see you next time.